I am Karen Stanberry, an elected trustee for the Board for Certification of Genealogists. I chair their DNA committee. I chaired the committee originally tasked with drafting the DNA-related standards, and I was involved in the ad hoc committee charged with the revision of the standards after the public comment period. Nonetheless, my opinions are my own and do not represent the position of the Board for Certification of Genealogists. The BCG application guide and rubrics, which can be found on our website, and genealogy standards constitute the authority in all matters related to credentialing. All living people identified in this lecture provided informed consent to use their details in educational presentations. Much of the information I will discuss today is drawn from this small volume, Genealogy Standards, the second edition, published in 2019 by the Board for Certification of Genealogists. Now, we know that not all family historians want to be certified, but this book is not just for people who want to be certified. It is not just for professionals. It is for family historians, all family historians, including those that limit their research to their own families. Genealogy Standards helps us to accurately describe our ancestors' lives, relationships, and histories. It helps all of us to not make mistakes as we reconstruct our ancestors' families. Our own families are just as important as paid clients and deserve the very best research we can accomplish. I always begin my lectures with the key takeaway points I strive to communicate in our time together. And for this lecture, the overarching key takeaway idea is that the book, Genealogy Standards, which I showed you in the previous slide, is not just for professionals. It provides guidance for everyone, professionals and amateurs alike, to achieve accurate results and reduce the likelihood of mistakes in DNA analysis for genealogy. Genealogy standards are for everyone. And I have supporting takeaway points, which include the Genealogical Proof Standard is the foundation for genealogy standards. Application of the Genealogical Proof Standard to an established conclusion is your best chance to achieve accurate results. And there is no rule book in genealogy. Furthermore, sound genealogy methodology seeks to rule out competing hypotheses until there is just one answer to a research question. And be aware of confirmation bias in your research. Be very aware. Throughout this lecture, you will encounter two characters. The first is the little genealogy gremlin. He plays tricks on you. He encourages you to take shortcuts. His life's mission is to cause you to reach inaccurate conclusions. He loves to aid you in creating your own brick walls. The second character is the golden nugget guy. He will magically appear with guidance that is golden, guidance that will help you defeat the genealogy gremlin. Let's go back to the basics. When we have a genealogical problem, we seek out sources to provide information to answer a specific research question. We turn to the ancestry.com and FamilySearch catalogs for possible records to consult. Now we can turn to a new source of information, DNA. I want you to think of DNA test results as a repository of records of sorts. Meet John Absalom Stanberry. He was born in 1858, probably in McMinn County, Tennessee. He is my second great-grandfather. John was my grandpa's grandpa. That's a much younger me there with my own grandpa, Ernest Stanberry. John Absalom was his grandpa. My biggest, tallest, thickest, most insurmountable genealogical brick wall is on this line. I know John's father, Samuel. I know his grandfather, Solomon. I even know his great-grandfather, old Ezekiel, who appeared as an adult paying tax on a horse in Frederick County, Virginia in 1787. John's DNA is one of the repositories that holds the answers to Ezekiel's origins. His DNA can provide critical evidence to help me learn more about John's parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. I inherited my grandpa's DNA, and he inherited his grandpa John's DNA, and John inherited his great-grandpa old Ezekiel's DNA. So I ask you, if you could go to a repository and find evidence of the origins of most of your second and third great-grandparents all in one place, and it only costs $79 plus shipping, wouldn't you go there? DNA test results are yet another source of information we use to answer specific genealogical research questions. These are typically questions about biological relationships. Some research plans addressing an identity-related research question may benefit from research in DNA, but BCG, recognizing that DNA evidence is not always available or relevant, does not require applicants to use it. BCG does encourage applicants, if not all genealogical researchers, to consider the availability and potential usefulness of DNA evidence, just like any other sources of evidence, to help solve each genealogical problem they address. Today, I will address two common mistakes in DNA analysis. The first one is the bad habit of ruling in instead of ruling out the answer to your research question. And the second is yet another bad habit, researcher confirmation bias. But before we get to that, we need to discuss some fundamental genealogy methodology principles. Let's think about the Genealogical Proof Standard. Are you a name collector? Name collectors say things like this: I have my pedigree back to the 1500s. The kids in this 1860 census record must be their children. I love shaky leaf hints. My ancestor is in 250 online trees. Gotta be right. I'll just ignore this conflict. Or are you a researcher? Someone who regularly interprets documents, considers all relevant sources, strategies, and methodologies, engages in problem analysis and research planning, employs tests of analysis and correlation, and regularly uses DNA evidence to address questions of biological relationship. Researchers prioritize and seek accuracy in genealogical conclusions. Researchers routinely use the Genealogical Proof Standard to successfully bust through their brick walls. Proponents of the Genealogical Proof Standard sing its merits. We plan our research to meet the Genealogical Proof Standard. There are 5 related components of the Genealogical Proof Standard. The first is reasonably exhaustive research. The second is accurate source citations. The third is tests of analysis and correlation. The fourth is conflict resolution. And the fifth is a written conclusion detailing the evidence and reasoning supporting a genealogical conclusion. Note, there you see the little golden nugget guy. He's right there in the lower right-hand corner. He's there to remind you of key points in the lecture. For your convenience, I provided the details of this key point and other golden nugget key points for you in your handout. A common misunderstanding in the genealogical community is that the Genealogical Proof Standard is a process. It is not a process. It is a measurement we employ to assess the credibility of a proven genealogical conclusion. This can only take place once the research is completed. However, part of the reason that we have this confusion in the community is because we do plan our research with the objective of meeting the genealogical proof standard once a conclusion is established. Dr. Thomas W. Jones, in the essential work, Mastering Genealogical Proof, further expounds on the 5 elements of the genealogical proof standard using in-depth descriptions of the methodology and reasoning required to meet the GPS. He discusses the use of DNA test results within the context of the GPS. I highly recommend this book. Instead of asking what's the answer, we should be asking what's the evidence. In Mastering Genealogical Proof, Tom says, quote, genealogists interpret evidence items from the past that have survived to the present. This evidence, much of it fragmentary and some of it erroneous, comes from sources that were imperfect the day they were created, unquote. I say, thank goodness we now have DNA sources to help us decrease the chance that our conclusions will be erroneous. We all learned the scientific method in elementary school. We observe our environment to discover patterns. We generate a theory, which we use to make a prediction, a hypothesis. We develop tests to assess the accuracy of our hypothesis. The tests produce evidence, which can be positive or negative. They can support the hypothesis or contradict the hypothesis. If the evidence is negative, we go back to the drawing board and create a new theory. The genealogy research and reasoning cycle closely echoes that same scientific method. We observe the data in our genealogy. We craft a research question. We gather evidence from information found in sources. The evidence provides direct and indirect answers to the research question. We develop a hypothesis. We test the hypothesis by evaluating the evidence with tests of analysis and correlation. We resolve any evidentiary conflicts, and then we establish a conclusion. In genealogy, if the evidence points to just one answer, we consider the conclusion proved. Of course, we recognize the conclusion can be overturned if new evidence is discovered to challenge that conclusion. DNA test results are included in the gathering evidence phase. The DNA test results are information we use. We use it comparatively to answer the research question. If I were stranded on a desert island and planned to spend my time doing genealogy, these are the 2 books I would take with me. Let's think about genealogy standards. The Genealogical Proof Standard provides the foundation for most of the standards detailed in Genealogy Standards 2nd edition. The 5 elements of reasonably exhaustive research, accurate source citations, evidence analysis and correlation, conflict resolution, and the written conclusion, those are all the bricks in that foundation of the Genealogical Proof Standard that supports genealogy standards. Genealogy standards are just extensions of the Genealogical Proof Standard. The 80 standards detailed in chapters 1 through 4 come in 2 flavors, process standards and product standards. Process standards provide best practice guidance about things like crafting research questions, planning for reasonably exhaustive research, using DNA evidence, conducting evidence analysis, engaging in evidence correlation, resolving conflicts in the evidentiary items. And the product standards contain guidance such as in areas about elements of creating source citations, choosing the right writing option for what you're discussing, using clear writing, and the characteristics of a good research report. The 2nd edition houses the 7 new DNA-related standards in an entirely new subsection entitled Using DNA Evidence. It's contained within Chapter 3, Standards for Researching. There are 7 new standards that provide best practice to guide us in using DNA, specifically for genealogy. The standards go into detail about planning for DNA tests and about analyzing DNA test results. Standard 53 provides guidance about reasonably exhaustive research as it applies to the extent of DNA testing. Standard 57 provides guidance about protecting the privacy of living test takers, something we all need to be aware of in today's age. Breaking news. No need to write down this URL. I provided the link in your handout material. In October of 2020, the trustees of the Board for Certification of Genealogists revised Standard 57, the one about respect for privacy rights, and the Genealogist Code of Ethics to allow for private sharing of DNA match details. The changes also eliminated the need for test takers to provide written consent for use of their DNA data, although they must be informed about the pros and cons of doing so. Though applicable to all genealogists, the changes responded to concerns about the use of genetic evidence in initial and renewal applications for credentialing. You can see the new wording at the BCG website at this URL. Remember, a genealogical conclusion that uses DNA does not need to meet only the 7 DNA standards. The conclusion must also meet all other relevant standards. DNA standards are not that hard. They are really just extensions of skills you already use in your genealogical research. You already know how to craft a research question and engage in research planning. You know how to conduct reasonably exhaustive research. You know how to study and understand the sources that you examine. You use tests of evidence analysis, assessing the likely accuracy of each piece of evidence you examine. You engage in tests of correlation as you seek corroboration. You employ inferential reasoning as you create a body of interrelated evidence to answer your research questions. You know how to resolve any conflicting evidentiary items you might encounter in your research. You create written reports detailing your evidence and your reasoning. All you need is that top block on the tower so that you can accurately interpret DNA test results and add them to your body of evidence. I'm here to remind you of everything you already know. I'm here to liberate you from any worry you might have about genealogy standards and DNA. I am here to tell you, you got this. Successful use of genetic evidence to solve genealogical problems really only requires you take your genealogical mindset and apply it in the same way you do with documentary research. And what are the key components of your genealogical mindset? Logic and reasoning. So in my effort to drive away your angst, I want to begin with a review of what we already know about genealogy standards. Thomas Jones wrote in the introduction to the first edition of Genealogy Standards that the word standard means, quote, something established by authority, custom, or general consent as a model or example, criterion, unquote. Angst about BCG certification predates the incorporation of DNA standards. Can you find the answer to these types of questions in genealogy standards? Should I use a semicolon or a comma? Exactly how many sources do I need to meet the requirement for reasonably exhaustive research? Which evidence explained citation template should I use? Is my conclusion proven if I only use online sources? Am I required to use probate records? Let's look at just 2 of these questions. Should I use a semicolon or a comma? Which evidence explains citation template should I use? Do you think Standard 5 instructs you on punctuation? No. It identifies elements a citation should include. It suggests we use Evidence Explained and the Chicago Manual of Style as guides as we craft our source citations. And what is the first thing Evidence Explained says about citations? That citation is an art, not a science. That we should learn the principles and then feel free to improvise. It is our responsibility to adapt those principles to fit source materials that we examine. Further, Elizabeth Schoen Mills even penned a blog post reminding us that the question, which citation template do I use, is not the right question to ask. The real question should be, what kind of source do I have? In this post, she kindly suggests the questioner engage in an attitude adjustment. Let's look at another common question. Exactly how many sources do I need to meet the requirement for reasonably exhaustive research? Genealogy Standards does not tell us how many sources we need. Rather, Genealogy Standards provides guidance to help the researcher judge when the research is sufficiently exhaustive. It provides parameters to consider. Have we gathered sufficient data to test and to support or reject hypotheses? Have we gathered all reliable information potentially relevant to the research question? Have we prioritized original records containing primary information? Genealogy Standards in no way gives you a magic number of sources or a magic formula. Genealogy Standards provides parameters of successful genealogical research. They are designed for the researcher to ask evaluative questions about their own research. It's all about judgment. The same framework applies to the DNA standards. Do you think you can find answers to these questions within the genealogy standards? How many test takers do I need? Are 3 generations enough for pedigree evaluation? Can I use anonymous matches? Is the Watto tool enough to achieve proof? Do I have to include spouses? If I have segment triangulation, do I need, you fill in the blank? How do I provide sufficient verifiable information? Again, let's take just one of these questions. Are 3 generations enough for pedigree evaluation? Standard 52, Analyzing DNA Test Results, tells us to address all relevant factors, including the accuracy, completeness, and depth of the pedigrees included in the analysis. It does not specify how many generations should be included. It guides us to consider the possibility of more than one common ancestor for each pair of DNA test takers. It provides parameters so that we can judge and evaluate our own work. Do you think you can find the answer to this question in Genealogy Standards? How many test takers do I need? Of course not. Again, the standards provide guidance to help you judge if you have enough test takers. You need enough to propose a genetic relationship, eliminate competing hypotheses, correlate with documentary research, and to resolve conflicts. Of course, this is highly dependent on the research question and varies from situation to situation. But fun fact to know and tell, comparison of just 2 DNA tests is rarely enough. Genealogical conclusions rarely meet the standard for proof if only 2 DNA test takers are compared. Genealogical relationships more distant than that of a parent-child or of siblings are supported by correlation of data from more than 2 test takers. There is no rule book in genealogy. There are no magic formulas. Genealogy Standards provides guidance for best practice. Let's consider a few foundational genealogy principles and their application to incorporating DNA into a genealogical conclusion. Standard 50 reminds us that all relevant evidence items are compatible with just one single answer to the research question. This applies to research in both documentary and genetic sources. It is a tried and true tenet of genealogy. Once a genealogist resolves conflicting evidence, all remaining relevant evidence items are compatible with a single answer to the research question. Consider that standard when we think about ruling in the answer to a research question rather than ruling out competing answers to a research question. In my opinion, the biggest mistake when using DNA for genealogy is people's tendency to rule in instead of ruling out. Ruling in often means jumping to conclusions, a tenuous position indeed. Think about it. Anyone alive on the planet Earth at the time of a child's conception could be the source of the shared DNA. As ridiculous as this sounds, the underlying logic will help you achieve accurate results. We start big and then eliminate candidates until we have just one candidate left. Always keep this in mind as you analyze your evidence, seeking an answer to your research question. The most important concept is you must rule out all competing hypotheses or all competing ancestral lines until the evidence points to just one answer. There are all kinds of ways to do this. Consider all other ancestral lines as competing hypotheses until you employ evidence analysis, evidence correlation, and reasoning to rule them out. Remember Sherlock Holmes. It is always wise to remember that the data drives our hypothesis, not our secret wish or hope for result. He says, it is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. Standard 27, note-taking objectivity, reminds us to not allow bias, preference, or preconception to affect our choices of information to collect and not to collect. I introduced you to the little genealogy gremlin in the beginning of this lecture. Remember, he plays tricks on you and he encourages you to take shortcuts. His mission is to cause you to reach inaccurate conclusions, and he just loves to aid you in creating your very own brick walls. He tells you in his velvety voice, see, your 5 shared matches all have Josiah Pencilbottom in their trees. The shared DNA must be Pencilbottom. I want you to shout back at that gremlin. Tell him that Josiah Pencilbottom had a wife, and of course her maiden name is unknown, and the shared DNA could be from that wife's ancestral line. A common research strategy is to excitedly open a group of shared matches and find the same ancestor in their pedigrees and then rush to the conclusion that said ancestor is the source of the shared DNA and proves the biological relationship. This is ruling in instead of ruling out. I see people doing this even when there are common ancestral lines in the same place and time. The common ancestral line may be the source of the DNA, but you can't conclude it until you have considered and eliminated the other ancestral lines. An unsound assumption. My shared match list includes multiple genetic matches. Each identifies the same ancestor in their pedigrees. This is the source of our shared DNA and confirms my trace pedigree. Unsound assumption. Now, Don't worry about the details in the next 3 slides. My intention here is to bombard and overwhelm you to make a point. Ruling in instead of ruling out may lead you to not meeting best practice guidelines. For example, this approach may lead to not meeting standards for Standard 11, sound basis, Standard 14, topical breadth, Standard 17, extent, Standard 19, data collection scope, Standard 27, note-taking objectivity, Standard 40, evidence mining, Standard 41, evidence scope, Standard 42, evidence discrimination, Standard 43, evidence integrity, Standard 46, evidence independence, Standard 47, evidence correlation, Standard 50, assembling conclusions from evidence, Standard 52, analyzing DNA test results, Standard 53, extent of DNA evidence, Standard 58, research scope, Standard 59, proof conclusions, Standard 63, honesty, and Standard 74, reports, bullet point 9. That's a lot of standards. Do I have your attention yet? Your best defense against making this mistake is to conduct pedigree evaluation and mitigate any pedigree evaluation problems you might discover. Mitigation is fundamental to proper DNA test result interpretation. Pedigree evaluation includes evaluating the pedigrees for accuracy, completeness, depth, and multiple common ancestors. The Board for Certification of Genealogists posts a series of helpful answers to DNA frequently asked questions on its website at bcgcertification.org in the DNA resources section. There are several posts specific to questions about pedigree evaluation. What is pedigree evaluation? What is required for pedigree evaluation? What are some strategies to mitigate pedigree problems? For example, this is my own pedigree, and you can see some significant gaps in my confirmed ancestors. That's because my dad gifted me with an adopted great-grandmother and an adopted second great-grandmother. Thanks a lot, Dad. Remember, Genealogy Standard 50, assembling conclusions from the evidence, that says all evidence must point to just one answer to achieve a proven conclusion. You cannot have multiple possibilities for the source of the shared DNA, even if you have the same ancestor with a match in both your trees. The gap may represent another possibility. You cannot prove that conclusion without first mitigating the gap. You could fill the gaps with more research, or in some circumstances, you can employ logic or inference to argue that the gap is irrelevant to your research question. For example, you could say that line was still in Germany at the time of this research question, and the studied line is solidly in Iowa. Or that line is clearly Swedish, and the studied line is Mexican. But you also have to conduct some form of pedigree evaluation for each of the DNA cousins you use in your analysis. Remember, they could have gaps, inaccurate trees, incomplete trees. Your chain is only as strong as the weakest link. The little genealogy gremlin plays tricks on you. He says, you and your match have the same ancestor in your trees, and the predicted relationship makes sense. Your shared DNA must be from that ancestor. Shout back at that gremlin and tell him that you haven't yet evaluated your match's pedigree for accuracy, depth, and gaps. Remind that gremlin that you conduct reasonably exhaustive research. You do that because you want to reduce the likelihood that new information could destroy your conclusion. Most recommendations suggest to conduct pedigree evaluation back to at least the generation of the predicted most recent common ancestral couple. However, I recommend you go beyond that if you can. Even if we forget about the gaps in my pedigree, I can tell you that these ancestors right here and their descendants are related to each other in 5 different ways. That is because they were part of a cluster migration from York County, Pennsylvania to the frontier of rural Illinois in the 1840s. The little genealogy gremlin will play tricks on you. He says, your family tree is accurate. You know your own people back to the generation of the most recent common ancestor. You're good. Shout back at that gremlin and tell him that going back just to the generation of the most recent common ancestral couple may not capture likely possibilities for multiple common ancestral couples. Tell him that your people lived in the same place for a long time and marriage pickings were slim. Tell him he can't fool you. You know, Odysseus had to plug his crow's ears with beeswax and tie himself to a mast to be able to resist the tempting sound of the sirens. When I get too excited about finding the same name in an undocumented online tree, I remember Odysseus, and I hope you will too. Take the time to rule out, to eliminate hypotheses instead of ruling in, jumping to conclusions. You will be glad you did. A related problem to ruling in instead of ruling out is researcher confirmation bias. Many common errors in DNA analysis result from researcher bias. There is a temptation to cherry pick matches because the said matches support a preconceived desired result. This is not sound scientific research. Sometimes this researcher bias is totally unintentional. I mean, we live in a quick click here for immediate answers age. Slow and steady, careful consideration of all the evidence in front of us is the key to achieving accurate conclusions. Consider Standard 53, evidence integrity. Genealogists do not trim, tailor, slight, or ignore potentially relevant evidence to fit a bias or preconception, to harmonize with other evidence, or for any other reason. I mean, who won that race? The little genealogy gremlin plays tricks on you. He says, finally, I have DNA matches to confirm that published unsourced genealogy. Shout back at that gremlin and tell him your matches likely read that same genealogy that you did and built their trees from it. Or worse, just copied your tree as their own. Luke, you're going to find that many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view. The truth is often what we make of it. You heard what you wanted to hear, believed what you wanted to believe. Obi-Wan Kenobi. I say Obi-Wan Kenobi is a very good gremlin tamer. We seek to confirm our carefully documented pedigrees, but remember, we try as hard to disprove our hypotheses as we try to prove them. DNA testing company tools such as shaky leaf hints, through lines, theories of family relativity, predicted relationship hints are each simply clues, nothing more. Many researchers have discovered errors in these predictions. Remember, the basis of shaky leaf hints, through lines, and theories of family relativity are online trees. Many are undocumented and are based on simply copying someone else's erroneous tree. Online trees are an error-prone source. Be careful. The little genealogy gremlin will play tricks on you. You have an ancestry through line with 6 matches that identify the most recent common ancestral couple and depicts each match's line of descent. Go ahead, add those ancestors to your tree. Shout back at that gremlin and tell him that 5 of those 6 matches only share a single 9 centimorgan segment with you. Tell him those segments could easily be pseudo-segments or the result of a pileup region. Tell him you use through lines as clues, nothing more. Remember old Ezekiel from my introductory slide? My grandpa's paternal great-grandpa, the guy who paid tax on a horse in 1787? Well, believe me, I have conducted reasonably exhaustive research on this guy. And as far as I can tell, there is not one single solitary shard of direct evidence that connects Ezekiel to his alleged parents, Nehemiah and Mary Minthorn. His alleged wife, Esther, is named Esther by one of their sons, and Esther Kremer in a marriage record, named Esther Neal by one of their sons, and Esther Kremer in a marriage record. Her probable birth year is all over the place, suggesting the possibility of two wives named Esther, and that must be ruled out. There is no evidence at all of a birth year for Ezekiel, much less a specific birth date of the 1st of January. There is no evidence at all that Ezekiel was born in Virginia, much less in Frederick County. As best as I can tell, all this information came from one man's guess, a guy who conducted Stanbury research in the 1970s and hypothesized in a Stanbury family newsletter that Ezekiel might be the son of Nehemiah and Mary, based on the same surname. They didn't even live in the same state. Now, of course, Ezekiel could be the son of Nehemiah and Mary, or he could be the son of someone else entirely. But there are 864 online trees identifying Nehemiah and Mary as his parents. 864 online trees. Those 6 records that are cited there in that particular tree include a War of 1812 service record for Ezekiel's son, also named Ezekiel, and falsely attached to the father. A Find a Grave database record that states, if you look on it and check on it, the memorial record for Ezekiel, burial is unknown. And by the way, I've tested the Y DNA for this line. His male descendants do not match with descendants of Nehemiah's kin. The Y DNA suggests another surname entirely. Try as hard to disprove your hypothesis as you try to prove it. Resist researcher confirmation bias. A tree with shaky leaves is very shady. Shaky leaf hints, through lines, theory of family relativity, they provide clues, not hints. Do your own research. Resist the shortcuts. Resist researcher confirmation bias. Don't just stand there staring at your brick walls. Go ahead, take a chance. Apply the Genealogical Proof Standard. Use Genealogy Standards and blast right through. My key takeaway for today's lecture was that the book Genealogy Standards is not just for professionals, that it provides guidance to help all family historians, professionals and amateurs alike, to achieve accurate results and reduce the likelihood of mistakes in DNA analysis for genealogy. I hope that you all agree with this key takeaway point and are giving me a virtual thumbs up for this concept. My supporting takeaway points included the Genealogical Proof Standard is the foundation for genealogy standards. Application of the Genealogical Proof Standard to an established conclusion is your best chance to achieve accurate results. And there is no rule book in genealogy. I can't see you, but I hope you're also giving me a virtual thumbs up for these takeaway points. And finally, I tried to convince you that sound genealogy methodology seeks to rule out competing hypotheses until there is just one answer to a research question. And I asked you to be very aware of confirmation bias in your research. I will never forget the trauma I experienced when I learned that Luke Skywalker's father was Darth Vader. I have never quite recovered from that realization. Remember, DNA can tell you things you or your family might not want to know. And always consider whether your family can handle the results before you ask anyone to do any type of DNA testing. With that said, are you ready to dive in? Are you ready to use DNA for genealogy? Come on in. The water is just fine. A big heartfelt thank you to FamilySearch for hosting this conference, and also to the Board for Certification of Genealogists for sponsoring this lecture. Thank you.